Good morning, and welcome to another Seize the Day. I'm glad that we are closing the week out together. It's been a good one. Trust that you had a really good night's sleep, ready to seize the day. Can you believe that it's already December the 3rd? It's going to be this second week in Advent coming up this coming weekend, and encourage you, if you have not plans, to make sure you come and be a part of what we're doing over the holidays. And if you're in other parts of the country, just make sure that you gather with God's people together and celebrate such a wonderful time of the year. We just got a lot of activity going on at church, as you can imagine. On December the 10th and the 11th, we have what we call our Christmas drive-through. I read these reports of many churches fighting volunteerism and attendance, but God has been really faithful. And I just want to thank everyone for their participation and their support, not only with their time and their talents, but also with their treasure. We've had over 125 people sign up for our Christmas drive-through, which is an event where we go outside on our campus, in our Greenland campus. And last year we had it was almost 600 cars that went through this Christmas drive-through celebration. And this year promises to be even more exciting. They have bought so many more lights. Families actually owned a number of the vignettes, so they've been busy decorating, and so it's going to be a great time. So that's on Friday and Saturday of next week, and so we're looking forward to that. And as well as our Christmas services, between all three of our campuses, we have services at 4, 5, 6, 7, as well as 10 o'clock at night. And so it's going to be a great time. Music is always phenomenal, and the energy is just going to be great. Last year was limited, but this year we hope to come back even stronger. And as always, again, it's just a pleasure to be able to come together, open the Word, and encourage one another to just lean into this walk that God has us on. So thankful for that. We've been looking at a series in the book of Matthew that underscored that Jesus is the Messiah that was promised. Everything that Matthew did just reiterated that for you and me in terms of his royal lineage to prophetic passages that surrounded his birth. And now what we'd like to do is go back and look at these stories. And the story that has had our attention this week is the story of Herod and Jesus. The wise men come and declare to Herod, who is the king of the Jews, right, living in Jerusalem, appointed so by the Roman government. And so when he hears this news, he feigns interest, right? He calls the Old Testament scholars, brings them in, the chief priests, the teachers of the law, and asks them the question, where is the king of the Jews to be born? And without hesitation, they turn and say, well, it's written in Micah chapter 5, verse 2, that in Bethlehem will come one who will be ruler and shepherd of God's people. And so the wise men go off. Herod tells them, look, when you find him, come back and tell me, because I too would like to worship him. Only when they leave and then they come back, they're not going to come back, because they're warned that Herod has ill intent, and so he wants to kill the child. And so what happens? They leave. It comes back to Herod that the wise men were not coming back. So he sends soldiers to the town of Bethlehem, and they kill the innocents there, 2 years of age and under. What prompts a man to do that? Well, in our study, we started thinking about this very conflict. And we looked at a passage from Galatians chapter 5, verses 15 through 24. In this text, what we were to uncover is that there's a call on us to live life based on the revelation that God has given us, not just in Jesus, but as the Spirit of God now is a gift that God gives to us, a gift that reminds us of God's truth, right? Convicts of sin, and it also praises righteousness. I mean, there is this Spirit that lives in us now, that its sole desire is that we might know the things that God has given to us. And so the Spirit now that lives in us is going to testify to God's will, to God's ways. And so consequently, as Christians, we said, live by this Spirit. And then the tail end of that is that you will not gratify the desires of the flesh. So I live by the Spirit, and I will not gratify the desires of my flesh, because if my desire is for the Spirit, it's going to be in contrast. It's going to be in conflict with the desires that I have for my own sinful nature. So one of the things that we learned from this passage in Galatians 5 is that there is a contrast between living life from my lens and living life from God's lens. God calling me to live this life of greater faithfulness towards Him. And as a result of that, you and I are now, we have these decisions that we are being asked to make. And so consequently, not only they're in contrast, they're in conflict with one another. And so we began to take some other look. And if you just went to the next chapter in Galatians chapter 6, in verses 7 through 10, there we read a very, very interesting passage. And I'd like to read that for you again this morning. It's a passage that says, "Do not be deceived. God cannot be mocked. A man reaps what he sows. The one who sows to please his sinful nature, from that nature will reap destruction. The one who sows to please the Spirit, from the Spirit will reap eternal life. Let us not become weary in doing good, for at the proper time we will reap a harvest if we do not give up. Therefore, as we have opportunity, let us do good to all people, especially to those who belong to the family of believers." You know, every day we wake up to this conflict that's taking place in our country, in all these, really harsh political discussions. And we hear this word being banted around, a lot of people being woke. I feel like passages like this is God's way of saying that we need to awaken. It's here, it says, as you have opportunity, let us do good to all people. How's that for being woke? And says we're not to grow weary in doing good, for at the proper time we will reap a harvest if we do not give up. So what is that saying about how God is going to make sure that His promises are being fulfilled here? So that led me actually to a book that I had read many years ago, part of the Multnomah Press series, a book by a man named John Lawrence called Laws of the Harvest. Great little book, just a fascinating way to look at these passages and be reminded again of God's faithfulness to us and His desire for us to lean into these promises that God has for us. So today, on Friday, December the 3rd, as we seek to seize this day, let's remind ourselves of some of these promises that come directly from this passage. One of the implications that we saw is that we reap much that we did not sow. Think about that. I gave the example of planting a tomato plant. You don't expect that you're just going to get one tomato. You reap a bounty, right? There's a harvest that comes from that. And that comes both for good and for evil. And so you think about that for a moment. There's a passage that's found in the book of Hosea that says, you sow the wind and you reap the whirlwind, right? So sometimes, you'll hear people say, I didn't do anything really that bad. I just did this one thing. But you opened up a door and that led down a path that was quite destructive. And It never would have happened if you didn't open up that door first. In contrast to that, sometimes we do one good deed and we receive a bounty because of that. See, this is a true thing because God is the one that is behind all of this. So that was one of the first laws that John Lawrence talked about. He also said, we reap the same in kind as we sow. It's amazing to me that that we can so deceive ourselves that we don't think that our actions have consequences, or when our actions produce the very fruit that they are intended to, we act surprised. See, we reap the same in kind as we sow. In other words, if I plant an apple seed, what am I expecting to harvest? Apples, right? But if I sow seed according to the desires of my own nature, am I not going to receive the fruit that comes from that? And that's what one of those passages in Galatians 5 was telling us all about. It's saying, look, if I sow to my sinful nature, from that nature, I'm going to reap the harvest of what? Dissension and rage and jealousies and envy. And there was this whole list of fruit that comes from desire that is misplaced. And so this text in Galatians chapter 6 is pointing out that as a man sows, that shall he also reap. We reap the same in kind as we sow. Here's another one. Law number 3, which says we reap in a different season than when we sow. Boy, isn't that true? We also maybe don't bring that correlation between the desires of the heart and the fruit that produces. God says it's either going to be fruit that's going to reflect your sinful nature, or fruit that's going to reflect the Spirit of God that is in you. And what is that fruit of the Spirit? The very things that I think so many people are really looking for, but they're looking for in all the wrong places. Somebody should write a song like that. Looking for love in all the wrong places. I bet you that would be a hit. Anyway, think about this. What is the fruit of the Spirit? Fruit of the Spirit is love, joy, peace, patience, gentleness, goodness, faithfulness, kindness, self-control. Who doesn't want a bounty of that? But you notice this text is also saying not just that you're going to reap in kind of what you sow, right? If I sow to the flesh, I'm going to harvest the acts of the flesh. If I sow to the Spirit, I'm going to reap from that Spirit his fruit. This is saying that there's a season that needs to take place, right? That the cycle is such. So sometimes we can be engaged in activity and we're duped into thinking that there really aren't going to be any consequence of that. Only let a period of time go by. And sometimes, you've heard me say this before, right? Sometimes if our lives are filled with a selfish kind of ambition, and we're just going after it, and we're getting promotions, and we're seeming like we're doing well, and then later on you see the effect that it's had on you, on your relationships, on your marriage, with your children. All of a sudden now you realize I've been chasing something, never quite got the kind of fulfillment that I thought it was going to bring. Only now you're going to reap what was sown, and that may have been quite a long period of time. But now here you are at a stage in your life when you realized I was climbing up this ladder of success, and I just found that you're on the wrong house. I was pursuing something that was never really going to bring me a sense of satisfaction, not the deep satisfaction that I'm longing for. And one of the things that I often think about in relationship to this different season is the book of Ecclesiastes, where you have the king Solomon, who is writing, looking back on his life, a man who withheld himself from doing nothing that he wanted, right? I mean, anything that he wanted, he did. He had wisdom, he had opportunity, he had money, he had power, he had position. And yet at the end of Solomon's day, he looks back and he says, there was a joy in the doing. But he says, but in the end, it's proven to be nothing more than chasing after the wind. You never really quite get it. And at the end of the day, as you live your life, you could rob yourself from a sense of peace. And then you know what happens? We start looking to ways to self-medicate. We want that peace in our life so badly. We want to feel this sense of joy and a sense of fulfillment and all those avenues that we thought we were going to get, right? Education, privilege, positions, resources, all those things. And at the end of the day, it seems to elude us because you don't realize until much later what you have been sowing, and now you're eating this bitter fruit. Now, there's another way to live. We reap more than we sow. It's that first law said we reap much that we did not sow, right? God is on the blessing side also giving you many things that go far beyond what it is that we have done. But this is saying that you're going to reap more than you sow. So there's that whole sense, right, of this one idea. You look at the lives of Jacob and David, and they serve to remind us that there are grave consequences for our sinful actions. 2 Old Testament, verses are, that speak to this, right, is what I just read to you from Hosea chapter 8 about, you sow the wind and you reap the whirlwind. David, look, David was a man after God's own heart, and God said that. But look at what he sowed into his life, and did it not really, his sin with Bathsheba, look what came as a result of that. This faction within his kingdom, the factions within his own children, his own sons, having to go off to war against them. And if that was not enough, you just think about the effect that it may have had on Solomon, and maybe much of what Solomon learned in his early adult years, so he saw modeled by his father. Now, you can't paint the brush and say everything that David did was terrible, because that's not true. God said, from David's throne, there will always sit a ruler, and Jesus comes to fulfill that. All I'm saying is God doesn't show favorites, right? As close as he was with David, David still was going to be disciplined for his actions. And David got a lot more than he reckoned for. And that's one of those principles here that we see about reaping more than we sow. There's another law here as we are spending time this morning. He says, we reap in proportion as we sow. So go back to this text again that we're looking at in, there is the thrust is that we're going to reap more than we sow. But notice what he says here. He says, the one who sows to please the Spirit will from that Spirit reap eternal life. A man reaps what he sows, right? So you sow, you sow in kind, you reap in kind, and we're not to grow weary in doing good. That's why he says you're gonna reap in a different season, and at the proper time you'll reap a harvest. So you're going to reap more than you sow, but you're going to reap in proportion. So if I plant a little, then whatever that harvest will bring could only be increased if I do more. And so here we find that God is saying we ought to be rich, in good deeds. We ought to be rich in the things that God would have us, to really be investing our time in. Jesus will say in the Sermon on the Mount, right? What Jesus will tell us in the Sermon on the Mount is that It says, lay up for yourselves treasures in heaven, right? Where moth and rust do not destroy, or thieves break in and steal. This idea of laying up treasure in heaven, what is that kind of treasure? The treasure in heaven is what God holds to be most valuable. Have you ever thought about what heaven is really going to consist of? We already know. It says that flesh and blood will not inherit the kingdom of heaven. So something is going to have to be transformed regarding these mortal bodies that you and I have. It says that this earthly tent will have to be put down and sown into the ground, so that what is the harvest that comes from that is now bodies that are incorruptible, immortal, right? Eternal. So this idea of heaven, it says the earthly things are not going to inherit this kingdom. So I'm working for a whole lot of treasure that it says moth and rust and thieves can destroy. Rather, investing myself in those things that are going to be in heaven in abundance. And what's that? It's people. Doing the will of God, our Father, is considered the treasure that we are investing in heaven. And God sees it all. And he says, and he will reward a man according to his labor. So to be busy about doing God's work. Now, granted, the text said, as you have opportunity, do good to all people. Yeah, well, some of those people, not so much, right? They can be a little exasperating. You'd rather surround yourself, with people who are not quite so prickly. But God's saying, no, you see, this is what I'm asking you to do. I'm asking you to let your light shine in the midst of the darkness around you. I don't want you to repay evil for evil. I want you to repay evil for good, because that's the only way it's going to be overcome. I want you to follow the example of my son, Jesus, who went that extra mile, who gave generously, who was compassionate and kind, even when he was ill-treated. And you're saying, well, that's a high bar. Of course it's a high bar. What do you think he saved you for? He gave us his spirit and says, I've given you a spirit of power and of love and of self-discipline. If you have the desire of the Spirit of God in your life, then you're going to have all the resources that God is going to give us to accomplish that. And when that isn't being accomplished, maybe that's a sign, that's a reflection that we're too dependent upon our own desires, our own sinful nature. And what's the fruit that's going to come from that? Have we not just seen this already in Galatians 5? And that's why that unrest, that dissension, right? This rage that sometimes is taking place within us is because we don't get what we want. And when we don't get what we want, you see, we act out in all kinds of ways. That's why, going back to Herod and Jesus, you can see here Jesus came to, he was the promised Redeemer that was going to bring the forgiveness of sin, to give life. He was the promised Messiah that was going to win the day. And Herod had absolutely no desire except for his own ambitions. And he reaped what he had sown in great proportion. Well, there's a couple of other things here that I think would do us well to take a look at. One of them is found here. It says, we reap the full harvest of the good only if we persevere. The evil comes to harvest on its own. Boy, isn't that interesting? He says, if you don't, he says, let's read it correctly here. The text, right, he says, let us not become weary in doing good, right? So this sense of weariness is real, isn't it? God's calling us to persevere. John Lawrence, he writes this. He says, the problem of the average believer today is not a lack of knowledge, but the application of the truths he already knows. And so we're urged to persevere as we wait on God, to deal with the trials and discouragements, read the word, living one day at a time. He says, seek ye first the kingdom of God, and what? All these things shall be added unto you. I had a conversation yesterday with such a sweet woman, and we were talking about, family struggles and how hard sometimes life can be. And I shared with her the story that Jesus shared about a man who owned a field, and his workers went out and they planted really good seed. And then at the end of the day, the man went to bed. And while he was sleeping, it says his enemy came and it also planted all kinds of bad seed. Well, the next day, the workers got up and they discovered what had happened, and they went to the owner of the field and they said, hey, your enemy came and he just planted all this bad seed. What do you want us to do? You want us to rip up, the bad seed? And the owner said, no, don't do that. Because if you do, you might actually be ripping up some of the good seed as well. So why don't we just wait until the harvest? Because when the harvest comes, it'll be very clear, what the good plants were and what the weeds were. And then at that time, he says, I will send I'll send my servants, and they will separate the good from the bad. And I think to myself, that's exactly what life is like today. You and I live in a world that's a mixed bag. It's got the good and it's got the bad. And sometimes they're neighbors. Oh my gosh, man, don't you wish you could just be that weed killer? There are times when I'm tempted. I'd love to go out there and rip out a couple of good weeds. But at the same token, I realize that's not my job. God's saying that that's his job. He eventually is going to do that. My job is to demonstrate that I am that good seed, that the desires of my heart are to please God, right? That I am walking in his spirit, because then that fruit of love, joy, peace, patience, gentleness, goodness, faithfulness, kindness, self-control, all of that will be a part of my life. And another thing, I grew up in New York City. My early years of high school and everything. I went to a high school in Brooklyn called Brooklyn Tech. We had over 8,000 that went to the school, and it was right downtown, and just concrete all over the place. And one of the things that I noticed, though, even now living here in New Hampshire, is that I can do all the really good things to create an environment that's conducive for the growth of the plants that I am planting. But the dumb weeds, they seem to have a life of their own, don't they? They just grow on their own. You don't have to do anything special for those weeds. It's the same thing about evil in the world. It's self-perpetuating. But God says that he's going to win the day. It's just a period of time right now. He's giving us all an opportunity to make those decisions, generation after generation, to pass that good word out so that people would respond. And you know what? That leads me to John Lawrence's last law of the harvest. He says we can't do anything about last year's harvest, but we can about this year. See, we planted seeds that turned out not to produce what we hoped they would. But here you have this opportunity now to set your life in a completely different direction, to begin to walk in a way that will please God. You don't think that if Herod would have repented, that God would have forgiven him? Of course he would. He's quick to forgive, quick to listen. So my friends, today, And of all these laws of this harvest, when you think about what we read, how there is this battle that's going on between whether we're going to fix our eyes on what God desires or what on our own sinful nature desires, recognizing that they're going to produce some very, very different fruit. That's a choice that lies before you. And I think John Lawrence is right. I can't do anything about last year's harvest. Those seeds have already been sown. But I can do something about this year. I can do something about today. And God says, your steps, he can multiply many times over, bringing you a bounty that you couldn't even imagine, a bounty of love and joy and peace, what seems to surround this whole season. My friends, seize the day. Go out there and live this way. Plant those seeds, even knowing that there's a bunch of weeds that are around. God will take care of them. He has a way of doing a much better job than even Roundup. All right, my friends, spend the day productively. And remember, God is good all the time. Love you. Glad to be a part of this community. If you're living in New Hampshire, visit us at church this weekend. It's going to be awesome. Music's great, and the fellowship is even better. So God bless, and Lord willing, see you on the weekend and next week. God bless.